Hello? I can't hear you.
Can you hear us now, Raymond?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Thanks, Justin. All right, excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to hearing number 27 for special purpose zones. And we have before us this morning one submitter. So good morning and welcome. If you'd like to introduce yourself to us and then proceed to tell us what you wish to tell us. But just to let you know, we've read the original submission and your pre-circulated evidence. So thank you very much for providing that. You don't need to reread that evidence to us because we've already read it, but you're very welcome to highlight key points and then we'll see if we have any questions for you. That's okay. And you don't have to wear your mask when you're talking. And if you just push the right hand button on that microphone, push that. It might take a second. Is it green or red? Yeah, so just warming up. So just wait a sec. And the button should go red and then it'll be ready to go. Right, good to go. Over to you.
Thank you. So my name is Claire McKeever and I'm presenting planning evidence on the Terrace special purpose.
Sorry, I can't hear properly.
So Claire, do you want to just pull the microphone closer to yourself? And then it's on a hinge so you can pull it down. And your light's gone off, so is it, there we go.
Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay, start again. My name is Claire McKeever and I'm presenting planning evidence on the Terrace Downs special purpose zone on behalf of the landowner and submitter PHC Terrace Downs Resort Limited. I'm accompanied now, fortunately, by Brett Taylor, who may be able to answer any panel questions that might be more appropriately directed to the landowner. I understand that my original submission, my evidence and council's 42A report have been pre-circulated and pre-read, and that today is the opportunity of the panel to ask me questions. I would also like to acknowledge that I have also read the hearing panel questions on the 42A report and the council planners' responses that were uploaded to the council website after the submission of my evidence. As an overall summary of the evidence, I noted that the 42A report recommended that the hearings panel accept the replacement outline development plan and certain changes to various policies, rules and rule requirements that were requested by the submission. The majority of the submission points were accepted by the council, some were accepted in part or rejected in part, and in some instances the 42A report sought some clarification from the submitter on discrete points which were covered in evidence, and I wasn't intending to recover those.
Right.
The submitter accepts most of the recommendations of the council's 42A report, and the remaining matters of difference were also covered in my evidence. These related specifically to the policy and permitted activity rules for the covenant and reserve areas on the lower terraces of the site, the request for the grandfather clause in relation to residential dwellings on each residential allotment within the zone, and the specific provisions for the maintenance area and maintenance utility buildings. Having considered the panel's recent questions, I consider that the matters seem to align with the points that I also raised in my evidence. These primarily considered the covenant and reserve sub-areas, the provisions for the maintenance and utility buildings, or at least the source of the wording of newly proposed rules. I would like to confirm that I agree with Ms. Lewis. I consider that new rules as suggested in the 42A report that follow the format of other sub-area rules and building requirements are appropriate where they have been added for new sub-areas identified on the ODP. The only exception to this is for the newly identified maintenance and maintenance utility building rules. I consider that the functional need of a maintenance and utility building needs to minimise visual effects while also recognising that they are appropriate in a wider rural setting. I note that the proposed plan, by creating a special purpose zone, does not refer to an underlying rural zone in the same way that the operative plan did. I consider a change to matters of control and discretion to be appropriate for these types of buildings on this basis, and that's in reference to Rule TEZ 5B and Requirement 6. Having considered this in relation to the questions already posed, I have now also noticed that should a utility building be proposed anywhere else in the zone, i.e. not in a maintenance area, this would be a non-complying activity under Rule 5B, with compliance referred back to rule requirements. Those rule requirements include requirement 4 for standard building design and appearance for the whole zone, and thus the activity standard status for a utility building outside a maintenance area would require specific design and materials, which is what the submission sought to avoid in the first instance, notwithstanding that we were identifying the existing ones shown in an existing area. Although I wish to avoid raising new matters, I'm of the view that this activity status could be reconsidered to be restricted discretionary rather than non-complying. The remaining matter to be considered further is in relation to the covenant and reserve areas. As a matter of clarification, there is no reserve at the current time, and I note that the diagram in the operative district plan is actually not correct. Further, the covenant with the Department of Conservation does not exist, nor does an easement over the public walkway through the site. I believe these were intended to be provided at some stage in the future at the time of the original plan change in the 1990s. However, this has not come to pass over the time with the development of the site. Until this occurs, the main consideration for the submitter is to ensure that the original intent for the zone for providing tourism activities is preserved, including in the privately owned areas. The proposed district plan provides for this across the site in Rule TEZ R12 for rural tourism. However, it would be preferable for the specific policy direction for the reserve and covenant sub-areas to be clearer in regard to this limited and small-scale level of permitted activity that is appropriate in these sub-areas. In evidence, an alternative proposed for P7, policy P7, has been suggested. As a result of these questions raised, and in consideration of rural tourism and how it applies to the zone, I now also note that it would be clearer if the proposed outline development plan were amended to remove the shading that refers to a tourism area on top of the clubhouse and the conference area on the site. This is potentially confusing when rural tourism applies to the whole zone. As noted in the submission, the further consideration of policy P2 in reference to tourism in relation to specific sub-areas, which don't currently include the covenant and reserve areas, needs further consideration to be applied appropriately and could also be added to P7 as an activity in addition to provision to avoid inappropriate development. I believe the evidence is sufficiently clear in relation to the grandfather clause and residential unit situation without further description. However, I am of course happy to answer any questions on any of the above matters.
Right, thank you very much. I'll see if we have any questions for you. Nicole, any questions? Lindsay, any questions?
Thank you for your evidence. I take it from the introduction that you're looking for additional relief, which is in your evidence in relation to maintenance buildings. Can you just explain that further for me?
So,
Oh, there we go. That's good now. Yep.
So the special purpose zone requires has a rule requirement that all buildings and activities, all buildings are required to be designed in a high country rural character. And the requirement rules of that require particular claddings and approval of the way a building would look. Okay. In the current situation, a utility building like a farm shed would, in a rural zone, look like a farm shed, but it wouldn't have the extra cost of building it to look like a building clad in stone or particular timber or those types of things. So the submission sought for maintenance buildings to be able to be considered by the district plan without the need to look the same as a dwelling or the other standard requirements for other buildings on the site. Bearing in mind at the time that many of the maintenance buildings were already in place and are already there. I guess the issue at this point is, should the hotel, for example, in the hotel area need a utility building that goes with it, it's kind of important to make sure that it's considered on the whole, but utilities are where, what utilities would normally be.
So these are for maintenance buildings outside.
So in the maintenance area, the new rule has been proposed in the 42A report, and that refers to a number of matters of discretion and matters of control that refer to this high country theme and character and the look of the building, landscaping, screening, those types of things. What I've said in evidence is I would have thought it would have been sufficient for the matter of control and matters of discretion to refer to minimising visual effects only, as opposed to the extra matters that were requested. So yes, I'm asking for something different than what is suggested in the 42A report.
Yeah, is that in the evidence?
Yes. Yes, the only matter that I've raised today is that if I was to get a utility building in conjunction with a hotel in a different part of the site, it would circle back and take us back to those standard building provisions that I was trying to avoid in the first place. Yeah.
My other question is in relation to the outline plan itself. The one which is attached to evidence is what different from the one that is in the proposed plan is notified. Okay, so you're effectively looking for a replacement of that plan.
Yes.
Within that, because obviously I think the as notified usually has your maintenance down as accommodation.
Yes. So one of the things we yes, they are.
Yes.
And the reason for that, when we made the submission in the first instance, was because we recognised that the council's plan as notified took account of what was on the site right now. And at the moment, it's primarily a golf course. There are residential houses and there are some of the terrace units have been constructed. The outdoor recreation area has been started, hasn't it? But the hotel, the hunting lodge, farm accommodation, those types of things haven't been done. And so the operative district plan provide for quite a bit of development that hadn't occurred, and we wanted to make sure when we proposed the new ODP that those things were identified in the areas where they were originally intended to go, but also taking account of that future development that we didn't want to lose by having a plan that no longer showed them. Yeah, thank you.
Raymond, any questions?
No, I don't have any questions, but I wonder if Commissioner Dash could bring his microphone a little closer because I'm struggling to hear him. Thank you.
Right, thanks. I just got 3 or 4 things I'd like to ask you about. And the first one arises from paragraph 28 of your evidence. And so I see the amendment there that you're suggesting, and I just wanted to put to you an alternative for that. And what I was thinking along the lines of, rather than saying avoid inappropriate development and then going on to try and define what that meant, if we were to omit the word inappropriate and to say instead something along the lines of avoid development in the sub-area and covenant sub-area shown on the outline development plan in TEZ Fig 1, so that's all the same. But then we'd say that does not contribute to maintain or enhance open space and landscape value. So it just puts it in a different context, which as a decision maker, I would find easier to understand. Do you have a comment on that?
I think that would work well too.
Yeah, okay, good,
Yep.
Thank you. The next question arises from your paragraph 48. And you've suggested there with your XXX being the date that the plan becomes operative. I was just wondering, would it be appropriate to instead have a date that the plan was notified? Because that is a fixed point where we knew where things are at, whereas a future date, we're not quite sure where things might be at that time.
I think that would be fine also because those 68 lots already exist.
Yeah.
The only thing that comes up out of that is if anyone were to do some strange boundary adjustment in between, that would change titles and change dates. But yes, as the time it existed at the date of the notification would be fine.
Okay. And my next question is from your paragraph 53. And it's in relation to rule TEZ, which is now 5B. So I think you were picking up on the change in the numbering when you did your verbal presentation. That was good. And it just appears to me, and I understand why you're asking us to omit to be Romans 1 through to Romans 1V. I understand that from your evidence. That would just leave, as you said in your verbal presentation, the visual effects. And given that's the case, and given that this rule applies to the little pink maintenance area that's on your map, with just that one matter of control, it occurred to me that would it be appropriate to actually make that a permitted activity rather than a controlled activity if there's only visual effects to be considered?
That's a fair question. In those areas at the moment are where the existing sheds are that hold the golf carts, and there's a shed out the back as well that holds a lot of tools and manages bits and pieces, greenkeepers things. So that pink area is already bunded and landscaped, and it has those sorts of things anyway, so it would be suitable for a permitted activity for utility and maintenance buildings to continue to be in that area, or there to be additional ones. I think that's fine.
And then I think in your verbal you suggested instead of defaulting to a non-complying activity, it could default to restricted discretionary. That would, if it was permitted, then I guess if it didn't minimise visual effects, we might want to keep that as non-complying.
Yes, so that's a consequential challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, I think when I've looked at the way the rules are set up, all of the expectation is that activities and buildings that are appropriate to that sub area are in that area.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of an anomaly that the wastewater area, for example, might need a pump shed, and that the hotel might need something for air conditioners or something like that. Now, when the hotel, for example, goes to the point of a consent, it has requirements it needs to meet, and I would hope that the utilities that go with it are part of the whole thing. It would only be a situation if it was on its own and separate. So in that case, I think there's some cover to that. I guess the issue is that all of those other sub areas, if you were to have a building for an activity that goes into the wrong sub area, they're all non-complying. So it's just picked up the same format as for everything else.
Yeah.
But they're obviously, because they're small buildings of that nature, they're less of a risk than the other types of buildings. So I think you could keep the controlled one and then keep the consideration of it. Permitted, I like the idea, prefer to have fewer consents as possible if that is a way that we can do that. But yes, I acknowledge that if you then can't meet a permitted requirement, then perhaps instead of non-complying, maybe that's where your restricted discretion would be more appropriate for something of that size and that type of activity.
Yeah. And given we're only talking about the existing maintenance area, which you say is bundled and landscaped anyway. Okay.
Yes.
And if it was to default, if we were to, of a mind, make it a permitted activity, given the situation on the ground, and if it was then to default to a restricted discretionary, what matters of discretion would be appropriate, do you think?
I think you would still, I don't anticipate, for example, for matters of control 4, for example, I don't anticipate groups of buildings, so I don't think that one would be too relevant. A utility building doesn't impact on neighbouring privacy because you're not in it like a residential unit, so I don't think that one is relevant. I don't think sheds have much opportunity to enhance landscape, so that's why I didn't think the second one was appropriate. But compatible with the theme and character of the site,
right,
would be something you could still consider, I would have thought, in addition to minimising visual effects.
Yeah.
But whether it's historic country, that's the one that's a bit hard to decide what that is. Natural and rural would be more relevant than historic country theme.
Okay. So just taking that a little bit further, would you be happy to give some consideration and put down in writing if we were to give us an option to consider making Rule 5 be a permitted activity, and then just specifying the default being RDS and write in the matters of control that you think would be appropriate in that situation?
Of course.
And then we can have an option in front of us to weigh up. That would be helpful.
I do have to provide the ODP plan.
Yes, you said
so
you wanted
to make. It would be useful to provide both together.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's from my next question. You said you suggested today, I think, a further amendment to the ODP. So if you could provide that, that would be great.
Yes. Yeah.
And then just that issue you said that if the hotel goes ahead, maintenance and utility structures would, I think you said, default to the general rural zone provisions, and that would circle back. I didn't quite catch what you said.
Right.
There.
So the maintenance buildings. So if it were to be non-complying, if it was to be in the incorrect sub area.
Yeah. So outside the pink zone.
Outside the pink zone. Yeah. The way the rule is written. So excuse me, I'll just find it.
Yep.
So it's 5B. To be in the pink area is currently controlled. And then it says to the side, it says when activity status is not achieved, when compliance with 5B1 is not achieved. So that's any building or structure is located in the maintenance area shown on the plan. So I read that to be that any maintenance or utility building that is not in that area is non-complying. And then number 4 then says when compliance with any rule requirement is not achieved, refer to the TEZ rule requirements.
Yep.
And the one that I was worried about, there is a rule requirement 6 for maintenance and utility buildings, which allows, it allows external surfaces of the building to have a maximum reflectance value, but requirement 4 above that actually also requires that cladding materials shall be timber, stone, textured, cement, plaster combination, So and then there's the landscaping rule and there's other bits and pieces, but the way the rule is worded for that reference to the requirements, it doesn't exclude requirement 4 for a maintenance building. And perhaps, if I may be so bold as to suggest it, the way to fix that would be when I provide you with a potential rule, I could revise that and refer it back to the right rule.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful if you could do that. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, that would resolve that situation altogether.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, in terms of timing, how long do you think you would need to do that little bit of work for us? Would it be a week or 2 weeks?
I could give it to you next week.
Yeah, that's fine. By the end of next week would be wonderful. Thanks. And if that could just be sent to Grace or Emma, our hearing secretaries.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And other than that, I had no further questions, but thank you very much for your evidence and coming in and answering our questions this morning. Did you want to say anything at all?
Firstly, just apologise for my somewhat tardy arrival.
That's right. Your microphone's taken. Can you just lift your microphone over because they take a little while to warm up?
Okay.
There we go.
So firstly, just to apologise for my somewhat tardy arrival. I didn't realise the traffic was as bad down here as it is in Auckland, to be honest.
No problem.
No, I think we obviously canvassed the ODP or the proposed plan when we first read it, which from our point of view just kind of coincided when we actually acquired the site, so it was all news to us. So we've fortunately with Claire and her team, they've been husbanding us through the plan. Obviously what we're looking to do is enact what was originally envisaged by the original developers, and it's going to take some time, but we obviously need to know the framework that we're working towards.
Yep.
And I mean, just to comment on the maintenance sheds. I mean, one of the immediate thing is we're going to have to enhance the wastewater treatment plant, because obviously over time, the development on the site is going to be more dense. So I'm just not quite sure how we could turn a pumping shed on the sewage site into a historic country building. So there's issues like that which seem minor in the case, but when we actually come to address it, it could be an issue. So from our point of view, obviously the way you're proposing to deal with it is more than appropriate.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll just see if we have any questions for you, Nicole. Any questions? Mr. Taylor, Lindsay, Raven, any questions for Mr. Taylor?
No, thank you.
All right. Well, that's very good. That's then.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Ms. Lou's just had a point that might be worth clarification. It just relates to that that Rec 4 that might be useful for Ms. Kiva and her right of reply.
Yep. So that relates to what? Sorry, catch what you said.
Ms. Keeler, you just mentioned that Rec 4, Rec 4 applied to maintenance buildings. The way that its the provision is currently drafted, Rec 4 is not attached or is applicable for maintenance and utility building structures. Recs 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 are.
Sorry, Recs 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 are, not Rec 4. So the Rec 4, which relates to design and appearance, which brings in some of those material matters that Ms. Kiva was referencing, is not one that would be in the read of the plan we would be looking to apply to maintenance and utility structures.
All right, well, thanks for that. So maybe it'd be helpful then, Ms. McKeever and Ms. Lewis, if you could put your head together and so the information that comes forward by the end of next week, if there's any issues that you need to clarify between yourselves, that can be set out in that material. That would be helpful for us, if that's okay. Great. All right, thanks very much for that. Yep, so we're now adjourned until 10:30.